today I am Cliff Matthews, the pastor of St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And today I am blessed to have joining me for a conversation the Rochester, Genesee Region's Executive Minister, the Reverend Dr. Sandy Hasenhauer. She is a leader within the American Baptist Churches USA, specifically over the Rochester region that St. Luke is a part of, and part of our ABC USA celebration, where we're trying to build our awareness of ABC USA, why it matters to us, and why it is a good fit for us. I wanted to have her introduce herself to some. We have new folk who are at the church, and she's not been there since before COVID, but she was a regular before COVID, and will be and will be back next year, of course, right? But she is an awesome sister, and I just wanted us to know her. And we're going to talk about her role, the region, and just hopeful that this will be insightful for some as we again push our awareness of why it matters for us to belong to the American Baptist Churches USA. Well, Reverend Dr. Hasenhauer, I have set it up. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for giving time out of your schedule. So I guess if you want to just give us a little introduction about yourself first, and then we have some questions that I want to ask.
All righty. Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Yes, I have been to St. Luke's twice. At least I know at least once, probably twice. And since our region home base, and I am born and raised in Rochester, New York, which is Western New York, I always say I'm not stupid. I try to visit the North Carolina churches in February. That's kind of my goal, but I will be there for your anniversary next year, May, a year from now, May. So, like I said, I'm born and bred American Baptist. My grandfather was an American Baptist pastor back before they called them American Baptist. It was a earlier permutation of our denomination. And in fact, he served as in my role that I have now back in the 40s and 50s. At that point, we weren't a region and it wasn't called executive minister, but essentially functionality, he was doing the same thing. So he passed away before I was born. I never had a chance to meet him personally, but I do have a photo of him in my office to help me remember those roots. And that feels important to me. And there's one church that I periodically go to visit here in Rochester that his name is on the wall of their previous pastors. So that feels very good. On the flip side, I also bring to this role the national perspective because for 17 years, I was on national staff with American Baptist Women's Ministries. So when I came into this role, I had both the local knowledge and the national perspective, which, as we get talking about the nature of our region in particular, was really critical to being able to be in this role and to hopefully be effective with this region.
Wow, that is so insightful, Dr. Hasenhauer. Sandy, I did not know the family connection historically. That is so impressive, right? So let's talk a little bit about American Baptist Churches USA. You mentioned its permutations, right? And so for those who don't know, we are the oldest mainline Baptist denomination in America. It is from this group, our group, that there was a split that became known as the Southern Baptists, and for a while American Baptists had the label Northern Baptists. Early in the 1900s, the name was changed, or well, in the 1900s, the name was
Over
changed
time,
from from Northern Baptist to American Baptist Churches USA. And so it is a historic, proud, steady, stable denomination. And I'm just thankful that we are part of that. Now, tell me specifically, Sandy, about what is it, how is it that St. Luke is part of the Rochester region? What are regions? And how is it possible for a church like St. Luke that is not in Rochester, to belong to a region that's not his geographical partner.
Okay, trying to do this in a nutshell without going into a full-on Baptist history and Baptist polity. Our denomination formed to begin with as associations of churches, and that's why our denominational name is not American Baptist Church USA, it's American Baptist Churches USA. That emphasizes the fact that we are a congregational polity, we are an associational organization. The only way we are together is because we agreed to be together. We have common criteria that we covenant together to work under. As the structure developed over time, we ended up with regions, and regions originally were essentially groups of associations that came together, and they were geographic. At one point, I want to say 1972, but don't quote me on this,
Okay.
I believe that's when geographic regions were sort of drawn up. And they were drawn up, yes, around geography, but also around the number of churches in any given area. However, even then, it was understood that there was sometimes a group personality distinction between rural areas and urban areas. And so some cities became regions unto themselves, and they were known, city regions. Go figure, great naming. And so Rochester became, in that time, its own region. So in the state of New York State, there were actually at one point 4 regions. There was Metro New York, which is New York City and immediate environs. There was New York State, there was Rochester, Genesee, and then there was also Niagara region, which was Buffalo. The Niagara region ended up folding many years ago because of finances, so now they're just part of New York State. But the Niagara Baptist Association is still going strong. So that's kind of how New York State developed into these 3 separate regions. Then in the 90s, back to one other important piece is that churches are only American Baptist insofar as they have a relationship with a region. So in regions where there's still associations, often the associations are the ones that welcome or dismiss churches in and out of the fellowship. We don't have associations in Rochester, Genesee, so we are, the region is the body that welcomes or dismisses churches out of the fellowship. In the 1990s, our denomination had a schism, not our first one. We've had
We are
several.
Baptists. We are Baptists, so
We are
that's part
Baptist.
of it. Yes.
One of my grandfather's favorite quotes was apparently, what do you get when you have 2 Baptists standing side by side? A schism.
A schism,
So
yes.
that's basically the way we work. So there was a lot of controversy, a lot of struggle, ostensibly about same-gender relationships, around LGBTQ plus rights. The reason I say ostensibly is because that was the presenting issue. What it came down to was a disagreement around what it meant to be Baptist. And so there were associations and regions that were dismissing churches based on their stance on LGBTQ plus inclusion. Then there were other regions like Rochester, Genesee that said, wait a minute, that's not Baptist. That's not who we are. That's not one of the criteria around which we covenant around. And so Rochester, Genesee led the way. I am very proud of this. This is well before my time, although I was pastoring in the region at the time. Rochester, Genesee led the way to change the denominational bylaws to make it so that a church was not only able to relate to their geographically proximal region and or association, that a church could instead apply to any region for membership based on a number of criteria. So starting in, I believe it was 1994, RGR welcomed in its first non-geographic church, which was the United Church of Granville in Granville, Ohio. Between that time and today, we now are almost half and half of churches in the greater Rochester area and churches in 9 other states in the United States. Um, so that also meant an interesting little factoid that I came across while I was doing some research last year was our region, Rochester, Genesee region, had about 35 churches from 1899 until 1994.
Mm.
So a significant part of our history, we hovered right around 35 for a very long time. Then suddenly between 1994 and today, we're at 50. So we actually we what is the percentage of that? We grew by 75% or something like that
Yes.
uh,
Yeah.
in that period of time. And we are still kind of catching up with ourselves in terms of what does that mean around our structure and our bylaws and all of that.
Mhm.
And essentially, what it means is the fact that when I was called to this position, the fact that I was already used to working hybrid, I was already used to working on Zoom, even pre pandemic. The
Mhm.
pandemic did not change the way we did much in our
Mhm.
region because we were already there. Um, so that's kind of the history. So now churches can apply to be part of whatever region they choose, um, whether or not that's based on geography.
Mhm.
During my last 5 years, we have added 5 new churches, but only one of those was already an American Baptist church in another region. We've also been growing through other
Mhm.
new churches, dual alignments, and so forth.
Wow. Thank you so much. That is so good to hear. Um, and tell us, Dr. Hasenhauer, what is an executive minister of a region? Are you the boss of the churches that are part of the region? Do you put the hammer down? What is
I
what
kind of want to
is
start singing "If I Had a Hammer."
well, yeah, I know, right? Uh, listen, so tell me what is an executive minister, and what is your relationship both to the pastor of a church as well as, more importantly, the congregation?
It's there's a lot of different interpretations around what an executive minister is, but what it is not is somebody who has authority over the local church.
Mhm,
Um, there's an element of of my role that is largely administrative. I'm the one that has to remind churches, by the way, and this is coming up, you got to fill out your cooperating church annual report for the denomination. I do things along those lines, but there's also parts of my job in which we are referred to as the pastor to the pastors, where I check in on how our pastors are doing. How are you doing spiritually? How are you doing emotionally? Um, where the difficulty comes in is that my primary responsibility truly is to the congregations. And so if there is conflict between a congregation and a pastor, um, I try to make sure that that pastor has pastoral support from somebody else so
mhm,
that I'm not in a conflict of interest issue. Um, so that becomes a little more complex. But I often say that my job is to support, encourage, resource, inspire, educate, inform, and then pray a whole lot.
mhm, mhm.
My job is not to tell.
Wow.
So,
Wow. And part of your responsibility, which I think is crucial, is the issue of accountability as far as being a member of American Baptist Churches USA, but also um, bringing credibility to those who enter ministry, right?
mhm,
That you are responsible for making sure that the ordination process, especially if it's a denominational ordination, that is done correctly, that those who present for ministry have gone through a rigorous vetting process, and you're also there to make sure that those incoming students, even when they come into late years of college, early years of seminary, understand this is the process, this is what it takes. And you are a wonderful, I can say it from experience, as you have engaged our seminarians, you are a wonderful resource to really help them understand and the church to understand how this all works. Tell us something real quick, Dr. Hasnauer, about the Rochester region. Tell me some notables. Uh, tell me some historic facts. I could think of one, but I'll let you name them because I
Oh,
just,
you start. You start. What's your one?
no, I would say that Rochester is the city, the region of one of America's greatest unsung heroes, Dr. Walter Rauschenbusch.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yes, and so he was the father or one of the leaders, not father. That's so patriarchal. Of course, it is father, duh. But he was one of the founders or the leaders, I would say, of the social gospel movement that was so foundational for the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and he has a root in Rochester, and
Yes.
so there could be others.
There certainly are. Primarily because we have well, I shouldn't say primarily. Rochester itself as a city was one of the strongholds of a lot of social justice movements back in the 1800s. We had, probably the most famous were Frederick Douglass, lived here for many years, ran his newspaper out of Rochester. Um, and Susan B. Anthony lived in the area. Her house is still here as a museum. And so those are kind of the two big names. We were a stop on the Underground Railroad. All of that was going on here in Rochester. Also, as part of New York State history and because of the Erie Canal and geography, we are part of what was called the Burnt Over District, which meant there were a whole lot of evangelists that came up through from New York City on the canal doing revivals and all of that. The Latter-day Saints got their start in Palmyra, which is about half an hour outside of Rochester. So there was a lot. The spiritualist movement, I think, also got its start in Rochester. There was just a
Mhm.
lot going on in the 1800s. So the Divinity School started out in Hamilton, New York, which is downstate, but then moved up to Rochester as part of Baptists had a very strong bent towards education. And so we brought, Rochester Theological School was the beginning of what is now Colgate Rochester Divinity School. Crozier Seminary, which is where Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from, was in Chester, Pennsylvania, moved up to join Rochester. Theological Seminary became the same seminary at that point. So he retired right before I became a student. But Snuffy Smith was one of the professors who had taught Martin Luther King Jr., was a professor at the Divinity
Mhm.
School. My
Mhm.
sisters had him. I unfortunately came just a little too late. And Howard Thurman has some relationships with Rochester, again, primarily through the seminary and so forth. So, yes, there are a lot. I always have to mention Helen Barrett Montgomery.
Mhm. Mhm.
She is a shero of mine.
Mhm.
Her father was pastor at Lake Avenue Baptist Church here in Rochester, which is the church I grew up in and I'm still a member of. She was, after she got married, she stayed at that church, and she was huge again on women's rights and on education. She was only peripherally involved with the suffrage movement. She took her women's rights far more down the Baptist missionary route
Mhm.
and was very involved in international missions, organized this huge, I can't remember what they called it, the Golden something, where they traveled. They had trains that they traveled across the country talking about Baptist missions and raising money, and just raised this extraordinary amount of money. She translated the New Testament. So there is a Helen Barrett Montgomery translation of the New Testament. And she was the first woman ever elected to the Rochester City School Board. And within the same year or two, she became the first woman ever elected as the president of a mainline Protestant denomination, um,
Wow.
as president of ABC USA. And that's all Rochester, So yes, we do have history and heritage here. That I'm just pleased to be a part of it. Here's another little interesting factoid. As I've been looking at what ABCRGR's direct involvement in social justice issues over the years has been, I was reading a book just offhand on the Attica riots to find in a footnote that the Baptist Union, which was the predecessor of ABCRGR, wrote a letter in support of the prisoners, when they ended up being charged and in jail, they wrote a letter of support saying these folks should not be incarcerated for what happened at that jail because the situation was so bad and so forth. Um, so we have had, obviously some really hands-on relationships with social justice issues, even more recently than Walter Rauschenbusch et al.
Wow. So, Dr. Hasenhauer, tell us, not me, tell us, the future of Rochester, Genesee region, how does St. Luke fit into that? How does congregations as a whole fit into the future? How do you see the future of RGR?
The future is fully based on the congregations because we are congregational. Um, I, I,
That wasn't a trick question, right?
well, no, I was kind of going down several bunny trails at once. There's a quote that from Alfred North Whitehead, who was a process philosopher, and there's a stream of theology called process theology, that he says, the many become one and are increased by one. And for me, that describes a region of churches,
Mm,
because as churches come together, we both become one, but we're increased by one. So for example, in our upcoming delegates meeting, we have before us an application of a new church. And this is a perfect example that if the delegates vote this church into fellowship with us, that church will become one with us. And
mm,
yet we're increased by one. So that church automatically changes who we are just by
mm.
virtue of them being part of this fellowship. Now, that's a little more philosophical, theological look at this. In brass tacks, every church that comes to us brings its own perspectives, its own gifts, its own talents, its own passion, burdens for ministry, whatever language you want to use around that. And that adds to who we are as a region, shifts who we are as a region, and so forth. We have maintained our our primacy of social justice, although it is difficult sometimes for us to do that in ways that people would want us to do it because we are a diverse denomination.
Mhm,
We are a diverse region. We
mhm,
have people in our churches, and we have churches as wholes that fall on every end of the political spectrum, every end of the theological spectrum, and
mhm.
so forth. So when it comes to things like making statements around certain issues, that's really hard for us to do.
Yes, it is.
And so there have been very few over time
Mhm, mhm,
that we do. I did write a letter shortly after George Floyd
mhm,
around racism, anti-racism, and how that was having impact on our churches.
mhm.
But I did not say it was a statement. It was
Yes.
a pastoral letter, essentially,
Mhm,
from me to our
mhm,
churches.
mhm,
And so that's a point of frustration for some folk. Um, we have had people say, oh, you're the welcoming and affirming region, which is the
mhm,
language that American
mhm,
Baptists have around
mhm,
LGBTQ inclusion.
mhm,
And I've also had to say, no, we're not.
mhm,
We have not made that statement
mhm,
as a region. However,
mhm,
the way we live together into our covenants together, the way
mhm,
we are led, the way we form our boards and everything
mhm,
actually is. We do not say you cannot be a member of the LGBTQ plus community and
mhm,
serve on our board.
mhm,
That's not a criteria for us.
mhm, mhm.
So in that way, we are living into that statement. We don't make that statement.
Wow. This week, the lectionary reading, and I think this is going to air after Sunday service. I'm pretty sure it will. But the lectionary reading for the last Sunday in January, the epistle reading is really addressing that same issue, where Paul is addressing basically the tension between knowledge and agape, and that, you know, insisting on having your way, knowing something is not as important as caring about the others who struggle. And
Mm,
so I think for those critics who would say I wish there be more of a stance for this or for that. I think that frees local congregations to take their stands and to know that it's okay to stand where you stand. And one of the things I love about being a member of the general board of the American Baptist Churches USA, representing the Rochester region, is when I go to board meetings, I come back so enthused or empowered because at the tables, there's so much diversity.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are on every end of the spectrum, and what is amazing is in that moment, in those meetings, there isn't this tension and this fighting, but this awareness that we're in this thing together and we are doing missions together, and our differences on these matters never take center stage or become the priority over the work that has to be done.
Right.
And I love that. I love the big tent of Baptist life. Um, I love it. I think this region, and we'll do well as a Baptist denomination to always remember the importance of conscience, right? And
Right.
let people have the right to disagree. Um, I know at St. Luke recently, the congregation just adopted our welcome statement that is clear about who we welcome into our fellowship. And I'm so proud that it wasn't pastor did it and just said, y'all, this is it, boom, that's done. But there was a presentation, there was a engagement and conversation. There were 3 meetings prior to a vote. There was robust pushback. There was um, an invitation for folk to come forward and say, basically, I don't get it, or wow, I think this is great. And when the vote occurred, um, and the final draft was affirmed and the vote took place, when the vote took place, there was a loud clap, like wow, and there wasn't anybody saying ooh, no, no. That's Baptist life, and I think it's great. I've talked too much, Dr. Hasenhauer, but we can do this because we do this all the time, and we can't
Yes,
keep
we do.
doing this because we got to stop. Now, one last thing I want to ask you, and then I'm a pause, and that is, tell us why it's important that St. Luke supports United Missions.
It is important because we can't do what we do without the financial resources to do what we do. Um, all of our, I'm speaking as a region, but look at this writ large for the denomination as a whole. Um, all of our financial resources come from our churches and from individual contributions. Now, that can happen in a lot of ways. Obviously, yes, the region has some endowments that have come to us for a variety of reasons, but primarily, sadly, around churches closing. But when those churches close, they want their legacy to move forward. And so they entrust the region with their remaining assets. Most of those endowments, however, are restricted. We have to use them for certain things, which is fantastic. But at the same time, we have operating expenses that eventually, if we don't have enough for that, we can't then manage the directed giving that everybody, is hoping we'll do. So that's just, the crass answer around we need this. I will also say, though, that we need the perspectives, we need the engagement, we need the involvement. We need people on our region board from our churches. We need people at our delegates meetings from our churches, because that is who we are. That's how we function. If a member of a church really buys into the Baptist polity thing and says, no, we can't have some, legislative body telling us what to do, then it's part of that participating. It's just like our democratic vote.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't
Mm-hmm.
use our vote, we are absenting ourselves from the process. And so um, voting is also important to me. I grew up in Susan B. Anthony town.
Yeah,
So yeah,
yes, yes.
um, that's kind of the same thing. We need your voice in American Baptist churches as a region and in the ABC USA. So it's a both and. I want to say in this that Cliff, as you were talking about, the the way your church went about
Mhm.
your decision making on the
Mhm.
welcome statement.
Mhm.
I wrote my doctor of ministry thesis around, if you say you believe in beloved community,
Mhm.
what does that actually mean around your structure, around your decision making? Let's look at the practical aspects of this. And I believe American Baptist Churches USA is the most diverse in every way mainline Protestant denomination right now. There is, as of a few years ago, there is actually no longer an ethnic majority. White ethnicity, it flipped. So there's more people of color now in ABC USA than there are white folk.
Mhm.
And yet many of our structures and decision making still come from a very corporate America, Robert's rules, all of that. Don't get me
Mhm.
started. So what I look at and what my training is in, what my education is in, and what my passion is around, how do we make decisions together in a way that raises all the voices, gives all the voices equal say in the decision making process. And so that is why we say things like, we can't make a statement around welcoming and affirming at this point.
Mhm.
Although I do always say any church can bring any statement they want to the delegates. You do that. And then we
Mhm.
put a process in there.
Mhm.
As executive minister, will I bring a statement to the delegates? Not like that. No,
Mhm.
that's the church's purview.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yes, it is. We need your voices
Mhm.
because without them, we are not acting out the realm of God here on earth.
Wow, exactly. Wow. And I did forget that I am speaking with a Howard Thurman basically scholar in our
Oh,
midst,
I
right?
love Thurman.
And I know, and we mentioned Thurman in our Bible study last week. Because again, it will air next week. This interview, but we mentioned Howard Thurman and his interaction with his grandmother, who taught him like church hermeneutical strategies, right? How you
Right.
have to appropriate what Paul has said. If not, we are in trouble, right? So I forgot that you are a Thurman scholar, and thank you so very much
I'm
for
a,
that.
a Thurman appreciator. I'm not sure that I would call myself a scholar, but yes, definitely. He's up there and one
Well,
of my favorites.
yes, he is. And listen, thank you so much. Now, we have been on for a while. Um,
We have.
this is inspiring. Listen, that's okay. That's okay. You know how we do. But now let's me just ask you this. I want to give you a chance to ask me a question because I've asked all the questions in this interview. You have a question you want to ask me? Talk about being,
To a degree,
egalitarian.
I think you've touched on this, but I would want to know what I want to know from every congregation that's part of our region is, how is it you view the region? What is it you appreciate, and what do you feel like we could do better?
Wow, thank you for that. I appreciate the Rochester, Genesee region. I won't go into how we got in, but there was an outreach to us in 2011 that I think has been life changing, at least for me, and I think also for our church, right? Um, I appreciate the Rochester, Genesee region because it allowed us to maintain connections outside of the local area. And it allowed us to be reminded that we're not by ourselves. There are other like-minded churches elsewhere, right? We may be on an island when it comes to some things, but we're not we're not on an island existentially, right? We are a part of something bigger. That has been absolutely wonderful. The region helped navigate us through. I've been a pastor now for over 30 years. I've only ordained and been part of an ordination process for two persons, and that would not have happened apart from the Rochester, Genesee region. Reverend Sandra McDuffie, Reverend Jonathan Davis came up through the Rochester process, and it is a process, and both of them would say it was a process where at the end you wanted to throw a shoe, you wanted to say I'm done, but they made it through, right?
We
And
try to be
so,
friendly about it, though.
well, you could be friendly and still say no or questions, right? And y'all did that real well. But the region itself has been, now for me, the region, especially the executive ministers. one of the things I appreciate that and I'm not going to get emotional about this, but I tell you, I appreciate it. I just don't hear from my executive minister when there's a question about why haven't I gotten your money. I have enjoyed you calling me in the height of the pandemic, and you just called to say you're on my mind. How are you doing with self care? And I'll be talking some BS, and you'll come right back around and say, well, how are you doing with self care? Because you knew I was doing horrible, right? And so that's what I appreciate, that there is a sense that you all, the region, makes it possible for the church to have connections, for the pastor to have connection, and you help us be able to to leave our imprint, right? Um, I told a colleague of mine a few minutes ago at the San Juan biannual for the American Baptist Churches USA this past June. I said to my colleague, I said, we need to appreciate what it means to be at the table. And it is the region that allows St. Luke and myself to be at the table. What we do with it, that's up to us. But there isn't a denial of an access to the table. And I appreciate that. What the region could do better or more of, I don't know. Uh, I think we're doing great. You led us through COVID, which is like going through World War III in some ways, for real, seriously. The miracle is that the region stills together because this is the age where many churches are closing, regions are struggling, but we're still here. So I'm just proud to be part of it, and I hope this interview helps St. Luke to see and to know. On Sunday, we will hear from the incoming general secretary. They will have heard from her, and then later they'll hear from our regional exec, the diversity in that women leadership, diverse women leadership. I think it's just beautiful. I am a fan of you, a fan of the region, a fan of American Baptist Churches USA. So I'm a older but yet still effective cheerleader, and I'll leave it at that. Don't get any other images. I just said that, and that's enough.
Well, back at you.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Sandra Hasenhauer. We have taken 37 minutes to talk about this stuff.
I think that's still
And
short for us, though.
well, I think it's still short for us. I was going to say, well, we're doing pretty good. But there we go. I am so proud. Thank you. And I'll see you in a few weeks
Yes.
in Durham. And I'm corralling my 20 folk to come with us to Durham. I told the
I want to
congregation.
see all the St. Luke people. I want to see
But
all of you.
tell them, because listen,
All of you. I want to see all of you. Bring it on.
listen. I have put out word. I've told them from the pulpit. Now I don't want to have to corral because if I don't have my numbers up, so by the time this airs, if my numbers aren't where I need them to be, I'm going to folk one-on-one saying, so I'll meet you at church on Saturday at 7. We'll leave because we're co-hosting and we got to do it. So thank you so much. I appreciate you, Dr. Hasenhauer. You have a great rest of your day, a great week, and thank you for being such a courageous and effective leader.
Thank you. Thank you for being you, and thank you for doing church.
Oh, thank you, my friend. You take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.